Hey, Cypher here. Scandals in the history profession are now news media spectacles, but the public used to ignore them completely. As the culture war heated up, so too did attention on these things. Since I've previously labeled certain historians as disgraced or specific acts as disgraceful on this channel, I wanted to dig into what makes them so. It's an interesting question. First, you have to define what a historian even is, and then how one can disgrace that label. In the process of researching that, I found some fascinating truths about how historians navigate and negotiate our professional ethics, which affect the way history is made. The basic definition of a historian is someone who contributes to the discipline of historical inquiry by publishing work through respected outlets. Since my dissertation, master's thesis, and a few articles are all on American violence in the Southwest, that is what I am a historian of. Though obviously I also specialize in public history, given my social media presence. Historians do not need to be professionals and therefore have any kind of job, but they do need to have published work. If they are professionals who work as historians for a specific institution, such as museum curators, expert analysts, or professors, which in fact I am one right now, then their job depends on remaining in good graces as a historian. So what makes a historian disgraced is whether they have lost the ability to be fully employed due to some kind of opprobrium associated with their name. So how can a historian become disgraced? We trade on reputation, so disgrace means ruined reputation among other historians, and that they no longer possess enough propriety to be trustworthy as a professional. You can be disgraced and still be popular among the public and journalists, but the historian community is what matters. Prestige can be rejuvenated, but suspicion will always remain. By my reckoning, there's 4 factors that can cause it. Those are fraud, bigotry, plagiarism, and misconduct. The bar for each of these is quite high, and there are ways to avoid opprobrium with all of these disgraceful factors. So let's get into how all of this works with a bunch of examples. Thanks to my patrons on Patreon for supporting my work. This is a fascinating topic, but a difficult one that I could never do without them and the people who buy merchandise, such as these t-shirts. There's many perks to joining my Patreon, such as seeing the previews or getting your username in the episodes. Every bit helps. Now on with our first type of disgrace. The most obvious way a historian can become disgraced is through fraud. If one falsifies their work and others find out, well, that's a pretty easy way to lose the trust of scholars everywhere. There's a reason why we put footnotes on everything, and that's verifiability. We build trust by well-sourced writing, backing up one's arguments. Without that, it's just a non-fiction narrative, not history. But there's been plenty of frauds caught in the act. A famous example was Michael Bellesiles with his book Arming America. It purported to prove that the founding generation was not as well armed as previously thought, and that Americans' fascination with guns came after the American Civil War. This was provocative to say the least, especially since the book came out just 1 year after the Columbine massacre, and the political debate over gun control was heating up once again. The premise of the book challenged a lot of the ideas that upheld the Second Amendment as an individual right to hold weapons. Indeed, numerous gun enthusiasts almost immediately vociferously denounced it. But the history profession backed what they saw as a brave new interpretation founded on meticulous archival research, awarding Bellesiles with the highest honor possible for American historians, the Bancroft Prize. The National Rifle Association soon funded denunciations of the book, prompting intense scrutiny into its sourcing. They had become an unscrupulous nuisance, prompting Bellesiles to call them a jihad of technical nitpickers. Nonetheless, they pulled up worrying problems that weren't so easily dismissed. The book had numerous blatantly dumb statements that anyone who'd bothered to have any research into weaponry itself would know a lot better, such as the idea that bows were more effective at warfare than muskets, and that muskets could not hit anything beyond 100 feet. Several historians came together within months of the escalation by the NRA to form a group and publish their own exploration of the book. They not only found the interpretive problems, but also quantitative and sourcing issues. One table in particular could simply not be verified, and numerous claimed sources did not exist. One later reviewer stated, "By sleight of hand, Bellesiles removed firearms from early American history." Bellesiles attempted to hand-wave away the criticism, first by saying it was minor and that the sourcing issues were caused by an office flood wiping out his notes. Neither excuse was convincing, prompting further investigations that would verify that Bellesiles had engaged in fraud. His publisher pulled Arming America, and Columbia rescinded the Bancroft Prize. It's the first and only time that's ever happened. Many historians still tried to defend Bellesiles as having only made a minor error that could easily be corrected, and the rest was just the result of a far-right witch hunt. And in fact, the table that was so egregiously false does not destroy the thesis that gun ownership greatly rose in the post-Civil War period, resulting in our current gun culture, which is somewhat ironically when the National Rifle Association was founded. But the coverage of the founding generation completely destabilizes the book's narrative. Bellesiles raged about there being too much scrutiny, even bringing some disrepute to other historians who defended him, which caused problems for everyone. Historian Peter Hoffer writes, "In Bellesiles' relentless drive to prove his thesis of a paucity of guns, he had convicted himself of the charge of professional misconduct in his earlier presentations of his research. Noble goals are not necessarily scholarly or historically minded. Bellesiles is a good man and often a fine historian, but motivated by the potential impact of his thesis, he apparently assumed that the ends justified the means. In doing so, especially after the profession backed him so hard, he's lost much of his credibility. When I started graduate school in 2014, the pain of the controversy was still fresh in many historians' minds. They used him as a cautionary tale, not just for how to become disgraced, but also how getting caught up in one's mission can blind the entire profession to misconduct. Bellesiles resigned from his tenure-track position at Emory University amidst an investigation. He eventually found work as a professor and has produced a new book, but it remains to be seen whether he can regain the trust of historians after such a scandal. Of course, it is interesting that one of his strongest critics got off lightly when similar issues came up with his research. John Lott was basically the NRA's figurehead during this. He's an economist, not a historian, so cannot become disgraced in the same way. Nonetheless, his profession should do the same because of the exact same issues with Bellesiles. He claims to have found that 98% of the time brandishing ends fights, and he interviewed a bunch of criminals over whether or not they chose targets based on knowing whether or not they were armed. Lott refuses to divulge proof of these surveys, despite years of journalistic inquiry. Furthermore, the Washington Post managed to hound him enough to prove that a good chunk of his other claims in More Guns, Less Crime are conjecture, and that he had estimated the statistics therein, not actually proven them, despite the footnotes saying otherwise, a clear case of fraud. This renders the core claims bunk, despite it being the basis of so much NRA talking points today. He has gone on to publicize false claims that immigrants cause more crime, and that the 2020 election was the result of crime. Lott is a fraud, yet remains in the good graces of the economics profession. Lott still gets published in economics rags claiming that affirmative action is hindering police work, and that abortion leads to more crime. He'd be disgraced if he was a historian, but you can get away with fraud if you are an economist, apparently. Even minor examples of fraud can nearly result in disgrace. Joseph Ellis repeatedly lied during lectures about his service in the US Army during the Vietnam War, while discussing his activism against the war, which was also extremely exaggerated. Stolen valor is certainly a concern for the profession, hence why Mount Holyoke College investigated him and issued a 1-year suspension. But this was never part of his scholarly work, since he is part of the Founders Chic movement and has never made such claims in writing. If anything, the suspension was a bit heavy-handed, but since it was at the same time as much renewed scrutiny on the history profession, Mount Holyoke had to come down hard on him. Ellis is certainly not disgraced, so as long as fraud doesn't affect one's scholarship, that is a permissible mistake. So let's move on to another type of disgrace. Hatred comes in many forms, but they are all rooted in bigotry, which is simply stubborn and complete intolerance. Far too many bigots attempt to disguise their hatred by complaining that their hatred isn't tolerated, or what Karl Popper called the intolerance paradox. But when it comes to bigotry, the first mover is the bigot. There's 4 main types of bigotry: prejudice, chauvinism, conspiracism, and fanaticism. If someone falls into one, they will inevitably spread out into more if unopposed. According to professional ethics, historians shouldn't be bigoted, obviously, but only one of those 4 will likely result in disgrace. Conspiracism is completely opposed to the history profession. That's a portmanteau of conspiracy theory. It has long been a well-recognized form of historical denial. The first time we know of the term conspiracy theory being used derisively was in the American Historical Review in 1909. Karl Popper first explored it as an inherently bigoted ideology in the very same book where he coined the term intolerance paradox. Also, anyone claiming that the CIA tried to create the term, yeah, you're just spreading a conspiracy theory, a fairly easily disproven one. Get better material. Beyond mere speculation about a possible conspiracy, conspiracism denies evidence and through those lies argues that the supposed silence is orchestrated to deceive investigators. It's a seductive ideology that allows for complete isolation from facts. For any data that contradicts the conspiracy theory may simply be said to be part of the conspiracy, no matter how ludicrous that makes the theory and its conspirators. Conspiracism is imagining a fantasy of their own choosing. Thus, when a historian becomes a conspiracist, that denialism requires hatred of the very thing they're supposed to be promoting, the historical method, that which is necessary to advance the scholarly field. This is why I've done so much work to combat conspiracism. But sadly, some historians have fallen down that path. Perhaps the most prominent example was David Irving. He first arose to prominence with his 1963 book, The Destruction of Dresden. It was extremely popular, but scholars quickly raised issues with its estimate of the numbers killed during the bombing, pointing to the fact that it simply repeated Nazi propaganda as fact without sufficient evidence to do so. It's unclear if Irving was merely gullible or had already begun his decline, but he wasn't espousing conspiracism yet, just mistaking a statistic. He claimed that 100 to 250,000 people died in the firestorm of Dresden in 1945, when less than 25,000 actually died. The book became a bestseller despite its excesses, spreading the ridiculous number to millions of unsuspecting laymen. Even Kurt Vonnegut cited Irving's distortion in Slaughterhouse-Five. Irving would continue to have similar issues, such as minimizing the slave labor that went into German rocketry, leading to an anti-fascist activist burglarizing his apartment. It wasn't until 1967 that he showed any conspiracism. He claimed that Winston Churchill had conspired to kill the leader of Poland in exile, a fast ally to Churchill, simply so that he'd somehow betray Poland to Stalin. Later that year, he blamed one British commander from World War II for the destruction of a convoy at the hands of a German fleet. That was a mistake, for Commander Jack Broome was still alive and successfully sued Irving for defamation. This loss and the growing disrepute for his previous mistakes likely sent him further down the rabbit hole. By 1969, he even asked a lawyer from the Nuremberg trials whether Jews had manipulated evidence. Nonetheless, he produced a biography of Adolf Hitler, which came out in 1977. This time, he denied that Hitler had any role in the Holocaust, instead portraying it as something only the SS orchestrated and the Wehrmacht somehow was clean of the atrocities. These were clearly false, and because of this bigotry, he was completely disgraced.
Do you think he was an evil tyrant? Do you think he was an evil tyrant? Do you think, answer the question, we have ways of making you talk.
I will go further. I will say he was as evil as Churchill. He was as evil as Roosevelt. He was as evil as...
But the book was a bestseller anyways. He wasn't quite denying the Holocaust as a whole, but bigotry always expands if unopposed. Irving continued denying history, promoting the Leuchter Report, which used a bunch of pseudoscience and vandalism in order to deny the use of Zyklon B at Auschwitz. After a couple of speeches in Austria blaming Jews for any hardship that befell them, popular presses finally dropped him after years of supporting his denialist literature. He eventually had to resort to the Institute of Historical Revision, which uses its innocuous title to peddle Holocaust denialism. And sure enough, he now regularly claims that Jews have orchestrated his downfall and that they merit persecution. When someone denies atrocities, consult the narcissist's prayer. It goes, "That didn't happen, and if it did, it wasn't that bad, and if it was, that's not a big deal, and if it is, that's not my fault, and if it was, I didn't mean it, and if I did, you deserved it." Those who deny atrocities privately wish it would happen again, but don't want to tarnish the public perception of their identity. Irving is simply a Nazi. Austria officially pronounced as much in 2005, imprisoning him for a year and permanently banning him from the country. And calling him a Nazi isn't hyperbole. He sued historian Deborah Lipstadt for defaming him because she had detailed his decline. In British defamation cases, you are guilty until proven innocent. But guess what? She won. It was such a fait accompli that Hollywood made a movie out of it, further publicizing Irving's disgrace. I even reviewed that one in one of my yearly roundup videos. And as an aside, I moved up the release of this episode because Tucker Carlson interviewed a wannabe Irving named Daryl Cooper, calling that podcaster with no published scholarly work the best and most popular historian in the US. Maybe we shouldn't be surprised by right-wingers sympathizing with neo-Nazi lies, but I was taken aback. Even Tucker's sycophants seem to despise this interview, but I've seen plenty of reactionaries supporting the bigotry. Cooper was never a historian to begin with, and as Irving's story reveals, he'd be fully disgraced if he'd ever bothered to actually publish something. That's probably the worst outcome of disgrace I can think of, so let's look at the reverse image of a similar case of bigotry. Ward Churchill was an American Indian activist that had gained some purchase within the profession despite much grievance mongering, basically because no one was really willing to dig into his research. Plus, he was somewhat isolated from historical critique because he worked as a cultural studies professor. But after the 9/11 attacks, he finally overstepped his bounds as a scholar and claimed that all the victims of the atrocity deserved it, because they were all little Eichmanns, as in the Nazi who had organized much of the Holocaust simply because they worked at the World Trade Center. This monstrous bigotry finally brought his other scholarship under scrutiny. Soon, all kinds of fraud came to light, such as him claiming that the US Army had used smallpox blankets in 1837, or that blood quantum laws were intentionally killing thousands of natives a year. A University of Colorado Boulder investigation found these falsehoods, and even that some of his legitimate scholarship was simply plagiarism, which resulted in his firing. Furthermore, they showed that he was a pretendian, falsifying his racial identity. He managed to get a claim of $1 for unjust firing, but a higher court vacated even that decision. He's become a perfect example of how sanctimony can blind the profession to one's wrongdoing. Ward Churchill remained an activist and has gotten significantly worse since getting dropped from academia, even now claiming that Europeans invented scalping, or that indigenous people lived in perfect harmony before the white man arrived. But no scholar takes him seriously. Heck, while writing this, I ran into a debate between him and Dinesh D'Souza, who is not a scholar, nor a historian, no matter how much he wants to claim thus, yet somehow Churchill made D'Souza look better in comparison and validates all his conspiracism about leftist academia. You have to really screw up for me to side with that charlatan. So I want to illustrate one more case of bigotry bringing down a historian before moving on. But this disgrace came largely because a non-historian lifted him out of obscurity and helped legitimize his conspiracism. Shelby Foote was a novelist who wrote a massive narrative history of the Civil War with zero historiography from 1958 to 1974. His work was not important, but was at least entertaining. When he started writing, the Lost Cause myth was popular and even respected. By the release of his third volume, though, that myth was no longer acceptable. He was a Southerner, so he followed that lost cause, which denied the role of slavery in the cause of the Civil War, portrayed the institution as benevolent, pretended that the North was the aggressor against the chivalrous Confederate gentry, and acted like Reconstruction's efforts to institute civil rights were meant to harm the South. I've done an entire episode on the Lost Cause, but suffice it to say the myth is bunk, and anyone who believes it is a conspiracist. Furthermore, Foote's conspiracism eventually led him to racism, where he thought black people were trying to destroy white heritage because they were supposedly inferior. He was doomed to obscurity despite the popularity of his prose. But the culture war would pick him up. Lynn Cheney ran the National Endowment for the Humanities from 1986 to 93. She despised anything she thought was unpatriotic and used the endowment to fund only safe triumphalist projects. An up-and-coming documentarian named Ken Burns wanted to make a miniseries on the Civil War, and so Cheney greenlit it because it promised to be safe and triumphalist. Shelby Foote was an engaging speaker and had many stories to tell, so he took a prominent place in the documentary, repopularizing the Lost Cause in the process. He hadn't been important enough to meet historians' opprobrium before, but afterward, he was now the legitimizing face for lost causers everywhere. With that myth back in the mainstream, historians discredited Foote's previous work. Disgrace didn't really matter to him, so he kept going. In the book Confederates in the Attic, the author interviewed Foote and revealed his growing racism and sympathy for the Ku Klux Klan. After that, even popular media stopped taking him seriously. By 2004, the mockumentary CSA satirized him. A year later, he died knowing he'd become a joke. If anything, he would have been better off remaining in obscurity that had prevented the scrutiny of historians. Foote was a victim of his own fame. The cardinal sin of academia is plagiarism. Scholars trade on reputation through the promulgation of ideas. To take someone else's ideas without credit is to rob them of that reputation. There's a pervasive idea that plagiarism is merely copyright theft, but even if a writer completely rewords an author's work, that can still be plagiarism. Give credit where credit is due, hence why I always put a bibliography and footnotes in my episodes. It's not just for verifiability's sake, though that is very much part of it, but also that I can point to where I am constructing these narratives from. A while ago, when I asked historians what their greatest annoyances were, the second most common answer was plagiarism, which I spoke of in this episode. We are hyper-aware of the problem, but here's the thing, it rarely results in disgrace. And if the public regularly remains receptive to bigoted historians, then they are almost unaware of plagiarists. And yes, I am aware of H-Bomberguy's excellent video on YouTube plagiarism, but it falls significantly short of showing how pervasive this problem is, to the point of conflating plagiarism with copyright theft. Some of the most popular YouTubers are plagiarists, not just the few he highlights there. That's one reason why so many scholars refuse to engage with this platform. For instance, here's one of the most popular nonfiction YouTubers plagiarizing my most popular video only 5 months after its publication. And somehow he gets it wrong in multiple places. But he didn't copy me directly anywhere, so it wouldn't be enough for a DMCA. Just the form, structure, argument, and narrative of my video, all without due credit, thereby robbing me of viewership with an inferior product. No wonder why scholars shirk coming here. You get crap like that, and there are so many other instances of such with my work alone. Most YouTubers who talk about history don't put in bibliographies or cite their sources, meaning they are almost certainly plagiarists. Without giving credit where credit is due, that's plagiarism. We do need more coverage of this topic, but suffice it to say, plagiarism is absolutely rampant on the internet and in journalism. But this is an episode about historians. For instance, Philip S. Foner plagiarized his biography of Joe Hill in 1965. Despite the Journal of Labor History exposing this a decade later, he never apologized and faced no repercussions career-wise, even getting a good position at Rutgers in 1981. So plagiarism does not necessarily result in disgrace. It seems to only matter if there is serious media coverage that publicizes the problem, and even then, it remains merely a professional disgrace. The public largely doesn't care. In fact, journalists are rather happy to plagiarize our work, so they wouldn't willingly expose themselves, of course. A lot of reporting about history from journalists is completely just plagiarism, over and over and over again. If they're not citing their sources, it is plagiarism, and that's the vast majority of journalists trying to report about history. My master's thesis was plagiarized within a year of its publication, and I won't be surprised when some journalist steals the scholarship in my dissertation without rendering due credit. For hack social media creators, plagiarism is basically the only way they can function. If they are not rendering credit, it is plagiarism. So for the case of plagiarism to result in disgrace, it must be extremely significant. The most prominent example of plagiarism is Stephen E. Ambrose. He arose to prominence through a series of books on World War II. By the 1990s, he had a well-tuned machine of researchers and ghostwriters pumping out regular books that became extremely popular. Band of Brothers was directly based on his book, and he advised on Saving Private Ryan. But allegations of plagiarism kept coming up. In the rush to publish, he had pilfered numerous authors. At first, he blamed any accidental plagiarism on his researchers being unscrupulous, but more and more examples kept coming up. Turns out his whole business of quickly produced books relied on plagiarism, and it became a huge scandal in the early 2000s. Ambrose would not see any repercussions though. for he died in 2002, leaving his son to shoulder the burden of his misdeeds. Hugh Ambrose could not escape the disdain of academic historians who avoided association with him even after he successfully got the sequel to Band of Brothers created, called The Pacific. He died young, but his father's disgrace certainly affected what little time he had left. Tied up with this scandal was another plagiarist, Doris Kearns Goodwin. Her book on the Kennedys had plagiarized 3 other books. She had even paid a settlement to one of the victims, but kept it silent until all the attention on Ambrose brought it all up again. In 2002, the LA Times publicized her malpractice and found even more plagiarism in 2 other books. Fully disgraced, she resigned her position on the Pulitzer Council, a regular position on PBS NewsHour, and as a professor. The scandal did not last long in the public eye, for she was quickly brought back in media interviews, expert advice, and new book deals. But she hasn't worked in academia ever again. She remains unredeemed in the eyes of many historians, and her newer books are often openly doubted. Kearns seems to be unconcerned, since her pop history career has flourished without the profession. There are many forms of misconduct that can get a historian fired. Most would not result in disgrace. There have been plenty of petty criminals caught. Normally, once they've served their time, historians with a criminal past can find a place at an institution. But some crimes are unforgivable for the profession, and their enormity can even reflect poorly on the perpetrator's scholarship, especially if the crime has any similarity to their topic of study. That can easily result in disgrace. And that is precisely what happened with Dino Cinel. Cinel was a Catholic priest who taught history at Tulane University. He specialized in Italian immigration, specifically with relation to how Catholicism defined resistance to it. Louisiana authorities found out he was in possession of child pornography that he had filmed in the 1980s. He had abused his position as a priest to make gay porn, some of it underage. He'd even pseudonymously published some in a gay magazine. Because Louisiana hadn't passed laws against CP at the time the crime was committed, he was acquitted, keeping the case sealed. Tulane would fire him, but Cinel managed to weasel his way out of Louisiana before anyone else in academia knew. After intense public outcry to hire an Italian professor at the College of Staten Island, which is part of the City University of New York, or CUNY for short, they picked Cinel while he sought to escape, even giving him the rank of distinguished professor. But quickly the story became public when Geraldo Rivera revealed it on his show. But CUNY was reluctant to fire him. Technically, these were past problems that no longer affected his scholarship. Furthermore, the loudest outcry against him was distinctly homophobic, biasing the administration against firing him. But some historians began to question his scholarly work and then campaigned for his removal in 1991. It took 2 years to rescind his rank and another 2 before CUNY dismissed him. He went into exile, and even the Vatican revoked his investiture in 2010. A lover stabbed him to death in Colombia 8 years later. Cinel is obviously an exceptional case. Rarely will misconduct result in such a major disgrace. There are likely other such examples of this kind of disgrace, but they simply don't receive much publicity. Historians are human too, so statistically some have to be criminals. But others simply escape disgrace through grifting. Historians can avoid the ostracization that comes with disgrace. We saw how Goodwin remained in the public eye, or how Bellesiles is trying to get back into the profession's good graces. But others avoid disgrace through political means, and it appears to be a highly effective strategy. Complaining about how academia is anti-American, politically correct, woke, or whatever reactionary buzzwords has become an easy way to gain support from conservatives ever since the culture war kicked off in the 1980s. It plays into book banning and government interference in curricula, both policies distinctly opposed to not only the history profession, but the pursuit of knowledge altogether. But it's an easy way to attack academic freedom from the outside. Nonetheless, some historians have used this to avoid disgrace, real or imagined. As such, this is distinctly a grift, a disingenuous way to escape the consequences of one's actions. The first example of this I want to explore is Elizabeth Fox-Genovese. She began her career as a Marxist historian and became the founding director of women's studies at Emory University in 1986. She apparently harassed her graduate students after that, regularly verbally berating them and creating kind of a cult of personality around her. Two even said that she demanded sexual favors. Complaints in 1990 through 91 led to a lawsuit in 92 that the university settled out of court. After that, she made a spectacle of converting to Catholicism and then publishing a book called Feminism is Not the Story of My Life. In it, she complained about how the PC mob had come to discredit her and the feminist elite were simply trying to enrich themselves by hating men. Just 4 years later, she was writing articles about how diversity and multiculturalism had destroyed the supposed meritocracy of academia. Or in other words, she thought too many black people and women were getting in. Of course, conservatives lapped this stuff up. Misconduct and bigotry of course disgraced her as a historian, but she wasn't concerned with that. All the criticism only bolstered her claims of persecution, allowing her to ride the conservative media circuit. As a neocon hero, President Bush gave her the National Humanities Medal over the opposition of the entire history profession. She gained accolades through grift and retired well. Other similar examples of this form of avoidance were Alan Weinstein and Stephen Thernstrom. Weinstein had gained access to KGB archives to investigate whether Alger Hiss was a spy, but the contract he created stipulated that he would be the only historian with access to it, so the archives closed once he left. This was obviously opposed to the history profession and caused much controversy. Furthermore, some of his interviewees claimed he'd misquoted them, and one even sued, but he refused to provide the original tapes despite claiming that he had them. To avoid the obvious issues of fraud, he instead claimed that anyone pointing out his wrongdoing was trying to suppress him for exposing the evils of communist infiltration in the United States. This red baiting was, of course, effective, leading President Bush to appoint him U.S. Archivist over the objections of numerous historians and the National Archives staff themselves. He was so abusive during his time that the National Archives had to institute a harassment policy. Thernstrom, on the other hand, didn't actually get close to getting disgraced, but he pretended that he did. He said something during a lecture that some students thought was racially insensitive. It wasn't any concern to Harvard's administration, but the college paper trumped up an article complaining about the incident. It really was a nothing burger, but Thernstrom pretended that he'd been persecuted out of teaching that class. He even said that he was a victim of McCarthyism of the left. New York Magazine ran an article claiming students were harassing him by pointing and calling him racist, even though he later denounced that claim. He became a darling of right-wing media and an example of political correctness gone too far. Dinesh D'Souza even used it as one of the prime examples in his error-ridden book titled Illiberal Education. And of course, Bush placed him on the National Council on the Humanities, which oversees the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is the most important funding source for the history profession. He and his wife used this notoriety to launch a crusade against affirmative action. Though Thurston was under no threat of disgrace, his attempt to avoid such a fate ended up fueling the right-wing boogeyman of political correctness, which has recently morphed into the moral panic about wokeness. Just more culture war nonsense. So if you want to get away with impropriety, well, just grift about cancellation or wokeness and you'll get enough support from conservatives to avoid the disgrace. As Hoffer concludes, no set of admonitions, however public or overly dramatic, will prevent scholarly misconduct. The real question is what the profession will do about such cases. And if I read the omens correctly, the answer is nothing. There's a few other lessons we can gain from this long study. Firstly, the profession cares more about plagiarism than the public. Next, never double down on lies or refuse to provide proof. Mistakes happen, but fraud isn't easily forgivable. Bigotry and misconduct can easily lose your standing. But sadly, there's plenty that get away with more minor forms of conspiracism and denialism. But disgrace has to be particularly egregious and publicized for any serious consequences to come. Historians are not immune from disgracing the profession, but it is an extremely difficult thing to do. Something has to be bad enough to warrant disgrace. Spectacles, but didn't even get a full line in. Little kitty kisses. Yes. Got something to say to the camera? Oh, thank you. You meow, you'll get picked up. There's a fly in here. He's gonna get it. He got it. Contributes to the reputation. Don't hit. Meow. Don't hit the frickin' tripod then. What are you gonna do? Whoa! Really didn't want to be picked up, huh? Well, you're picked up now. What are you gonna do about it, goofball? You're stuck. You're stuck. Well, thank you. Yes. Okay. Meow. Forms, but they are. Meow. Meow. Testimony can. Meow. Meow. King's on top of the bookcase, but still meowing at me for some reason. Today I've been drinking High West double rye.